I've known Mark Gold for more than 30 years. I first got to know him after he left Yale. He went to WashU, went to Yale, and ended up eventually through a somewhat circuitous path at the University of Florida, where he led the department as the chair until very recently, and had the department relatively highly ranked, both in terms of training as well as research. Mark has always been a pioneer and somebody who's willing to think outside the box. So early on, when I first met Mark, we had a common interest in thyroid dysfunction, and Mark was one of the first to publish studies that demonstrated that patients with mood disorders had higher than rates in the general population of thyroid disease, in particular autoimmune thyroiditis. He really published groundbreaking work that's been replicated by my group and others many, many times. But it would be incorrect to say that that was Mark's lasting contribution, as important as it was. In spite of all of his interest in biomarkers in psychiatry, before the science really allowed them to be developed, he developed an interest in addiction. And as Mark knows, I often send patients to the University of Florida to their addiction recovery program. He has now replicated this program nationally and multiple times. It would be a fair statement to say that the obesity epidemic, viewed as an addiction, really began with Mark's conception of food addiction and obesity in the same way we think about drug abuse. At a time when drug abuse was viewed as tolerable, perhaps even desirable, Mark presaged the opiate epidemic. He warned us for years that we were going to end up where we are today with this horrendous epidemic and of opiate overdoses and deaths. So he's a prescient individual. He's been awarded multiple awards for his work in drug and alcohol abuse. From a clinical point of view, from a policy point of view, both at the state level and the national level. And he's a fabulous speaker. Let's give him a warm welcome.
He's even better than... Well, that's just great. And I try to live up to it. It's a challenge. And as Charlie said, there are few of us here who've been at all of the chair summits. And if there's anyone here other than myself, please thank you very much. And thanks also for saying I was a decent lecturer, because there's a trap door here, and once the votes come in, they open it up and I descend. So this is a new area for me, and I've done a lot of this work with Nora Volkoff's group, and it's really on the concept, an old concept, related to dual disorders. And some of you have had interest in this area, and I'll try to do justice to it, and as we move along, give you my kind of point of view. So let's just go right ahead. It's chicken or egg. I don't have any disclosures related to this. My main disclosure, I really like it if you write a good review of my work. So keep that in mind the next time you do this. Look at this. I'm the most brilliant and prolific. And that's a major conflict because I carry this review with me. I spent 3 years writing a book on tobacco, and the book, as a result of a JAMA review, sold 38 copies. So my 2 daughters, who are academic physicians, one is interested in psychiatry, said, that proves you're addicted to work, because you'll continue to work and do what you think in terms of your field, regardless of the actual reinforcement. And that's a pretty good definition. In addiction, as it moves along, reinforcement pales, and it's just survival. I also, I'll get to some of the articles. If you write over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers, the joke about that is some of them are good. And just like at this meeting, you vote on whether they're good on the basis of who cites your work. So Charlie mentioned the food and addiction, and actually in my first paper on constituents of food possibly being addicting was in the very early 1980s. But I had 0 citations until very recently, other than me citing my own work. But we'll see the cocaine work comes back, and opiates and internet, and it's been a lot of fun. So the objective here is to examine some of the neurobiology. I'm going to briefly mention our basic science studies in methamphetamine, in bath salts, and in other drug states that suggest the possibility that drugs of abuse, certain drugs of abuse, in certain doses, in certain durations, cause brain injury that results in what looks like a dual disorder. But it is not pre-existing dual disorder in the old way of looking at it, which is why do psychiatric diseases cause addiction or vice versa or both? I'm going to come down on the side of both. So from the psychiatric side, the work really starts with Ed Kantzian. And Kantzian was a Harvard psychoanalyst and thinker, suggested at a very early date that people selected their drugs on the basis of drugs that would make them feel whole. So, for example, if you had panic attacks or generalized anxiety, you would be the first person at the bar at a party. And he even suggested to me, and I was mostly interested in dual disorders as an addiction psychiatrist, he said, you just go and when a party opens up, go to the bar and sit there and talk to people. And I'm not adverse to that, so I did that. And it did turn out that the person who would be the first to the bar might have the most social anxiety. It was kind of a useful demonstration. He went further and said that people who loved smoking cigarettes had attentional problems. And that was a big part of my tobacco book. As many of you know, they gave tobacco out on the assembly lines. Henry Ford himself gave tobacco out because tobacco reduced boredom, tobacco smoking, and reduced error rates, so that he had a better assembly line by having smoking workers. Kantzian kind of went over the edge, in my opinion, when he suggested that people got addicted to cocaine because they were depressed. And that was a self-medication for depression. Because when I saw and reported on cocaine addiction and cocaine withdrawal, people were profoundly depressed, more depressed than ever when they were addicted to cocaine, and oftentimes took their own lives. But nevertheless, I do really think that self-medication, the idea that you have a pre-existing psychiatric disease, and that makes you more likely to choose a certain substance, and that makes you more likely to be addicted to that substance, comes from Kantzian's work and is the one side of the chicken or egg. The corollary of that isn't all that useful, in that if a person had a pre-existing anxiety disorder and became an alcoholic, if you treated their anxiety disorder, their alcoholism, their alcohol dependence did not go away. But it did suggest that if you treated both, the outcomes would be better. And I do agree with that. In addiction theory, there's a common silence about the question of premorbid return of function. And you can see this in my old mentees, Nora Volkov's work, even with Jean-Jacques Wang, where she looked at dopamine receptor recovery over time after cocaine using PET imaging. Using PET imaging at 6 months, few, if any, of the cocaine-dependent subjects showed full recovery. That's at 6 months with confirmed abstinence. In old animal science, we used to allow animals to self-administer, and they identified what their brain reward threshold was. In other words, how much juice would they need or want to feel good. And each animal, each person, Bob Heath of Tulane did this in humans, each person has a brain reward threshold. And it's different depending on a variety of factors, life experience, genetics, and so forth. But for all drugs of abuse, they raise the brain reward threshold, meaning that they make it more difficult for the person to feel good. And the return to normal is a question. And I've questioned that myself. And this subject of drugs and brain function is so current that my daughter, who's, as I mentioned, at Stanford in psychiatry, sent me this Chelsea video.
I just think everybody abuses.
Can you make that a little louder?
I certainly have. I want to show people what happens when you get up.
I would never recommend that.
No, nor would I. When you've done a lot of damage to your brain, is it reversible? I'm just asking for a friend.
Oh, for sure.
Did you like that? Now, I'll send you the video if you email me the link, because I can't spend the whole show. She has a whole series on drugs and drugs effects. She's vomited on national TV, taken the variety of drugs, but here she interviews a drug abuse expert who said, for sure, drug effects are reversible. But there is no data for that. It's never, like drugs of abuse are not tested for safety and efficacy. They're tested in a field test of people taking them. It's not like a pharmaceutical that's tested for safety and efficacy. The idea that of drugs not having any prolonged neurobiological effect is rarely been tested. Now, we tested that, and I'll get to that for methamphetamine, for bath salts, for cocaine, has been tested recently by the great Solomon Snyder. And those data are pretty clear that at certain dose, which would be at a certain duration, the neurobiological effects of targeting the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reinforcement system, undermines the cells, undermines the structure, and makes them function less well forevermore, or at least as long as we can study them. So, to look at where we're going to be talking about in a gross sense is that repeated use of drugs change receptors, induce epigenetic changes, gene expression changes, affect cell morphology and cell biology. All drugs would not be equal, just like all medications wouldn't be equal. The changes occur with even use, depending on vulnerabilities, and there's a process of moving on to addiction, which is kind of the institutionalization of those effects. As addiction occurs, we then see different changes. You have Vaughn McCall speaking, who just did a fabulous paper looking at sleep. There are prolonged changes that occur, not only state-dependent changes, not only memory changes, learning changes, motivational changes, appetite changes, sleep changes, affect changes that persist long after the drug is gone and the person is abstinent. And that's kind of the nature of this talk. Edcansian, which is pre-existing, or ours, which is the drug effect, and I'd say both. That leads to post-addiction abstinence states where the addict still has impaired judgment, impaired impulse control, impaired sleep. Impaired sleep is persistent, by the way, for maybe a year, memory and decision-making. And to say that they are normal just because nausea, vomiting, diarrhea is gone is to show how primitive science has been brought into the modern day without evidence-based approach. Acute abstinence has been defined principally by third-party insurance companies rather than by neurobiology and evidence-based research. That's quite sad, but also true. As you know from Nestler and other work, epigenetics change the brain. The changes can persist. In animals, it's been easier to study, of course, than in people, but it's a very important research area, and I've been happy to know Eric very well since Yale, and we both got Lifetime Achievement Awards this year, and you can see the changes that he's demonstrated in his work over the years. So Charlie mentioned that at one of the previous chair summits, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we were talking about how drug use begets drug use, and we tend to forget the lessons of the past. And this is a 60s cover on the hippie generation and drug use, which is a deja vu again. To remind everyone, in 1962, only 2% of the United States population had ever tried an illegal drug, and by the 2013, it's 10% or so just in the last month. Now, these are not performance-enhancing drugs in the sense that they've had to recalibrate the SATs to now, I think, 3 full times lower and lower and lower to account for the difference between 1960s SAT test scores and current test scores. According to the most recent Glamour magazine, by the way, this is the real reason to go into addiction. I get to read High Times, Glamour, and I'm sitting on an airplane and people, I say, I'm studying. These are my journals. And it's fantastic. But according to the most recent Glamour magazine, which has an article that says, is everyone on something, and concludes, yes. At least 1 of 3 women are currently using drugs recreationally. 42% of women have used opioid painkillers recreationally, quote unquote, used Adderall, used Xanax, used cocaine. It's 24%. And there, by the way, I can't really go into this, but the drug czar, Michael Botticelli, and I went to Cartagena recently, and there are a whole fleet of drug-running submarines that are going back and forth from Colombia with cocaine to the United States. And we have satellites watching them, and we catch them sometimes, but the Colombia, but I think it would be naive to think that this opioid epidemic won't be like other opioid epidemics, but rather it will be the same, meaning that it will be followed by a cocaine epidemic. 63% have taken drugs while drinking. We know that from club studies that we've done, as well as interviewing students. 16% admit to a blackout, and greater than 10% smoke marijuana every day, which is quite remarkable. It seems like this is the nation's fastest growing industry. Now, prevention is the only safe and effective cure, and this is an old prevention ad that I had the chance to work on when I was at Ad Council, and you can see what the challenges will be today, because the ad unsold cigarettes on the basis of linking cigarette smoking to being uncool. But if drug use is cool again, a la Glamour, you can see what the challenge is.
There was this guy who I thought was terrific. I mean, well, self-assured. And I really liked that in a person. Anyway, one night I saw him at a party. And I got up the nerve to say hello. And then he took out a cigarette. Blows my whole image of him. I mean, I know I make some people nervous, but I thought he had it together.
Smoking, it's a dead giveaway.
I think people who smoke are real losers.
Wow. And look at the progress made in cigarette smoking. We went from 50% or close of smokers to under 20. We have the total number of cigarettes consumed per day. We used to have 2-pack a day smokers. That would be unheard of today. We have clean air laws. We had a lot of support, and you can kind of see that coolness as well as danger relates to drug use. This is an old ad that I was the psychiatrist working on this team that we did in the 80s, really early 80s, before the cocaine epidemic. And you'll see that it's exactly the same as you would probably do today in response to the opioid epidemic.
When I grow up, I want to be a track star.
No one ever says, I want to be a junkie when I grow up.
But I want to be a ballerina.
Yet thousands of kids let getting high make a mess of their lives.
I want to be a nurse.
Don't let drugs get in the way of your dreams.
Now, we had Narcan back then, so it wasn't a Narcan shortage, but we did have opioid overdose without widespread availability of Narcan. There's other ways to help with prevention, and one, of course, is to speak to people who are involved in law enforcement. I'm active in that, and with the Drug Czar and DEA and education. Another way is to talk to psychiatrists, and as I said, I was a clinical faculty when Nora was recruited to the residency, and worked with her early on, and she keynoted the APA meeting, and so has made addiction psychiatry and tried to get psychiatrists to think more about getting involved in helping people with addictions. And she did this at the APA meeting by talking about her own family.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's a privilege for me to be here with all of you and to celebrate all of the fellows. And I want to thank the APA and Dr. Sommergaard for giving me the opportunity to share this moment with you. I've devoted all of my life to study the effects of drugs in the human brain, to try to understand what is it that they do to our brains that in some people that are vulnerable can lead them to the complete loss of control with severe catastrophic consequences. But before I actually go into that and what I've learned, share with you, I want to share a personal story that perhaps can help you put it in perspective. As Dr. Sommergaard mentioned, I was born in Mexico City. And many, many years ago, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I remember having dinner in my family with my parents and my 3 sisters, and there was a man that came to deliver a telegram to my mother. I remember my mother crying after she read the telegram, and I had never seen my mother cry, and I wanted to console her. But she did not want us to see her cry, and she left the room and locked the door behind her. Next morning, my father will tell us that the father of my mother had died. And it was many, many years later, when I had gone through medical school, when I had completed my residency training in psychiatry, when I had already been working for many years using brain imaging to investigate what drugs do to our brains, how we become addicted. At the time when my mother was dying of cancer, and she called me and said, "Nora, I need to tell you something I never spoken to you about." And she told me that my grandfather, her father, had been an alcoholic, and that in utter distress of not being able to control the strong urges to drink alcohol, he had killed himself.
So I think addiction is a kind of disease that touches everyone, and part of the anonymity in the recovery process of old has made it difficult for us to connect. But it's a not all that uncommon problem. I think the association between drugs and alcohol and suicide has been minimized, and we'll talk about that maybe as a chicken or egg. Like, think about this. If what we learned in medical school is correct, and that every drug, the opposite effect is what you see in withdrawal, then if you take opioids and have pinpoint pupils, in withdrawal you have dilated pupils. If you take opioids and have constipation, in withdrawal you have diarrhea. If you take opioids and have euphoria, then in withdrawal you have profound dysphoria, which actually can become anhedonia, depression, despair, and lead to suicide. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Each of the celebrities, and I have a whole 30-minute class video that I used recently at Washington University in St. Louis, of all the celebrities who have died, and you can think of them. Each of the celebrity deaths do not change behavior, because everyone looks at the celebrity death and said, oh, they just took the drug wrong, or they weren't as smart as I was, or they had this or that other problem. And that tends to be very bad prevention. I'll skip that for you. And there's another side, which is the kind of cowboy mentality, so that some people have used it to prove that they're really better than the rest of us because they can take drugs and still be standing. So the question of how we get addicted we've made great progress in that regard. When I first went into the field, of course, we didn't know very much. We had no basic neuroscience. We know a lot now, and we know that self-administration defines a drug of abuse. That self-administration, avid self-administration, is very important. And so you can see this in a cocaine animal waiting around for the white light to go on so that the cocaine key will be activated. But knowing that the key's activated, it basically just hangs around. It is like no other life. You can put a wheel in there. You can put a female animal in there. It won't matter much. They'll wait around. The light goes on. Their whole life is defined by the light going on, hitting the lever, and just injecting yourself with cocaine, whether you need it or not. So that we know all drugs of abuse are self-administered by lab animals. Brains sense them, and that would be the same for all these drugs of abuse. And animals and inhalants is a question, but the rest of them are pretty straightforward. And you can also show seeking behavior and abstinence so that animals, you can have a dark and light chamber. If you always made the drug available in the light chamber, animals just hang out in the light part of the chamber, waiting for the key to be activated. I'll skip that. You can do the same thing in humans. A human that uses cocaine, you can play the song that they associate with use, and their brain lights up in anticipation. You can actually just walk up behind them and say, cocaine. And that's good enough to get their brain activated. You can show them cocaine paraphernalia. You can show them cocaine use. All those things activate the drug and cause the drug effects. So what can we say over this? I mean, I have, I guess, almost 45 years of publication in this field. We understand addiction by the drug itself. Cocaine isn't cocaine because cocaine and Coca-Cola is not the same as cocaine and crack. We need to know how it's used. Cocaine tea, for example. Route of administration relates to this. Dose. The best dose example is the current example with cannabis, and I have a video I won't be able to show of High Times cannabis. Woodstock 1 cannabis, 0.5% THC. High Times award-winning cannabis, 24% THC, meaning 48 joints per joint. You can say that people will smoke less, but that wasn't the experience with tobacco with enhancing the nicotine. Duration. Binge use versus chronic use have different effects. Fit in the brain. Some drugs just have a terrible fit in the brain. Bath salts has a terrible fit in the brain. You can still feel euphoria, but the grinding sound that you hear at the neuronal level is just discarding brain reinforcement and brain motor pathways. So I add neurotoxic effects. The user has Kantian-like pre-existing vulnerabilities, but there are other vulnerabilities, like was the child born of a mother who used drugs while they were in utero? Is the child born into a household where there's drugs in the air? And so forth. Is there exposure during critical periods? Age of first use. When is the age of first use? I've reported, and other people reported, that impaired doctors have an 80% 5-year outcome when followed by our group, by any group in 38 states with urine test confirmation. In a Robert Wood Johnson study that we did with Tom McClellan and Bob DuPont, reported a number of times. But one differentiating factor for doctors in this study is age of onset. They had a lot of chance to get their brain together. And when they started using drugs, even if they experimented as a young person, they managed to keep it under control usually until their internship or residency. Pre-morbid function is very important. Genetic and epigenetic, you could be born with a reward deficiency syndrome. You could be born with the ability to wake up and feel pleasure every day of your life. And you'd have very different things. There's social factors. In monkeys, for example, which has been well studied, social order of macaque studies, the lowest ranking social monkey has the lowest vulnerability to a cocaine addiction. The alpha monkey, the highest ranking monkey that gets food first, gets sex choices first, has almost a cocaine resistance. So social factors are going to be very important, as well as child rearing. I could spend a whole lecture on this, and still it wouldn't hopefully. So what are the risk factors? Access. Of course, if cigarettes are $7 a pack, it's a lot easier to understand why we're using less than when I was going to medical school and we gave cigarettes for free to veterans, and when it was 17 cents a pack. Dose, potency, purity. You can see the purity effects right now as they've mixed in fentanyl with heroin. Delivery, IV, and host response. So those are the main factors. Our group was the first to report on dopamine in a serious way related to addiction, and the work was pretty simple. At the time, Goodman and Gilman said cocaine blocked reuptake, therefore it released dopamine. Our group said that's fine in acute use, but anything more than acute use, it's the opposite, because you could use more dopamine than you could make. And so cocaine addiction was a dopamine depletion state where the person needed cocaine to get almost any dopamine out into the synapse. And that was then replicated by Nora, who did PET imaging to show dopamine depletion states. And it's a compliment that my article in 1985 on the dopamine depletion hypothesis is really the model for NIDA's current working model that's on their website that you get a kick out of.
In this study, researchers demonstrated the rapid passage of cocaine through the brain and showed that the intensity of the volunteers' cocaine high parallels the trajectory of cocaine levels in the brain. 2 minutes after the cocaine injection, the volunteers report being high as the drug begins to flood the brain. The volunteers' rating of their high and the amount of drug in the brain are at similar levels relative to what their respective peak levels will be. 4 minutes after the cocaine injection, the volunteers' rating of their high peaks simultaneously with the amount of drug in the brain. The drug is most concentrated in the striatum, the region of the brain that produces feelings of reward. The volunteers' perceived high, the amount of drug in the brain, and the drug concentration in the striatum remain near peak levels 10 minutes after the cocaine injection. At 20 minutes post-injection, the volunteers' high and the overall amount of cocaine in the brain have subsided to roughly half of their peak levels. The drug remains most concentrated in the striatum. The volunteers' high has almost entirely subsided 30 minutes after the injection. A moderate amount of the drug remains in the striatum, with little remaining in other parts of the brain. 40 minutes after the cocaine injection, the volunteers no longer feel high, and the drug is undetectable in most parts of the brain. Altogether, the study demonstrates that the cocaine high parallels the trajectory of cocaine levels in the brain, the striatum as the reward center, and dopamine, its primary neurotransmitter, appear to be particularly instrumental in producing the high.
Well, the post-cocaine effect is anhedonia, and that lasts much, much longer. So yes, all drugs of abuse could be viewed like this in producing the positive affect, and the flip side being anhedonia with chronic use, all causing these dopamine deficiencies. But all drugs are not equal, again, and we always have to keep that in mind. That's a model. I'd be happy to send you a new model of neuroadaptation, but which is now starting to rethink the negative reinforcement side of addiction, so that you feel so bad, you feel so depressed, you're so anhedonic, and the only thing that can make you feel together is to reuse. So it's not just, a withdrawal reversal, it's this chronic state of post-drug depression, which, if untreated, causes a lot of problems. So I started in this area with really great psychiatrists who helped me think about addiction and psychiatry in an organized way at WashU. And as Charlie said, moved on to Yale. I moved from WashU and Florida, where I worked in rodents, to Yale, where I worked in non-human primates. And our lab with Gene Redmond was on the roof there. And it was amazing, a really amazing time, because 1975, we had naloxone. We also had at Yale New Haven Hospital a rule that said that we could not admit any drug user or alcoholic to the hospital. So the residents that were activists at that time would treat people in the emergency room. We would treat overdoses and take people to church basements for AA or NA treatment. And I think this is a hero that is mostly forgotten, the inventor of naloxone, and also the inventor of naltrexone, who invented these drugs even though they weren't in widespread use, or in any use for that matter. When we first gave naltrexone in human trials, nobody would take it, because we were forced to give it in a storefront methadone clinic, where literally at one like this, you'd come in, and this desk you got your methadone, and this desk you got naltrexone, and no matter what, you tended to move to this desk because those people were feeling a lot better. So we then worked on clonidine. It's a patent of mine in our group. And then clonidine to naltrexone. So we did rapid detox. Our group showed that if you gave people, instead of one shot of Narcan, 15, you could detox them in an office. Now, it wasn't that painless, but you could really do it because you just occupy the receptors. Each injection of Narcan, they had less and less withdrawal, and then I could switch them to naltrexone. And we just bootstrapped that in the ER because we weren't allowed to admit the patients. Even the clonidine study, and you might really remember that I published in The Lancet, it was a day study. And people have asked me about this, since 1978. It was because I couldn't admit the patient. I had to do the whole study during the day. It's just remarkable. And that was our work. And I made the cover of the New Haven Register as curing opiate addiction, which I know is funny. I've been trying to hide from this mostly ever since. But look at it. You see, that was the technology in 1978. Was this Kodak slide. But of course, we didn't cure opiate addiction, because even if you detox people with clonidine and put them on naltrexone, they all stopped. Even though it was a perfect drug, orally effective, cheap, rapid onset, long duration, safe, no tolerance, non-addicting, no withdrawal, they wouldn't take it. Wasn't reinforcing. And the common reasons was, I'm cured, I won't use again. That didn't work out. Or that they don't need it for any number of reasons. But that didn't stop APA from giving us the Foundations Fund Prize, because it was the first medically assisted treatment in psychiatry, and it was also the first bench-to-bedside treatment, where we had a model in animals, and we then developed a treatment in humans. And I got a Lifetime Achievement Award even in 2016 from the drug czar in this. I could play you, but you can imagine what they say about you. They think that you're dead, or finished. And my wife was in the first row watching this, and she's crying. And I'm saying, what's the matter? And she said, I just don't like the sound of this. Lifetime achievement. You know, I like the idea that you were the new investigator. But I'll skip it, but that's Michael Botticelli. So our work led to detox and acute abstinence treatment. Left alone the question of protracted abstinence, but we did try to develop treatments to reduce craving, reduce relapse, and treat comorbid conditions. And this is a great book if anybody's interested in addiction, because David Musto and Bob Bick, two of my mentors, suggested that the reason for drug epidemics appearing one after another in the United States is the Glamour magazine reason, that every generation thinks it's smarter than the last. Every drug trend burns itself out when people see firsthand the effects. There's no doubt the effects of opioid pain medicine. There's no doubt the effects of heroin right now. There's no doubt the effects of fentanyl mixed into heroin. All the Narcan in the world isn't going to save us from the problems. That's clear. So now we have to move on, and we're moving on to cocaine, hallucinogens, and high-potency cannabis. So we all know that the consequences of addiction can be devastating. And this is a good example, the kind of pre-addiction look. And it quickly morphs into this. And in a chronic state, it can even morph into that. So you wonder, how could that happen? The person loses so much judgment and insight. And then you see that a basic tenet, as the Chelsea Handler question, are all drug abuse effects reversible? Has never been answered to my satisfaction, and it shouldn't be set to your satisfaction. That can you piece the person back together again? So yes, you could be predisposed, but I think more likely you have a drug-related consequence. And that's been my shift. And there are people who have been picking up on this as well, that say that we know so little about initiation, and we know so much about intoxication, and we need to learn about abstinence state to be able to help people better. I've kind of written on this, not knowing what to do other than write books. And, it's probably there's an inverse relationship between the number of books I've written on the subject and how much I actually know. And unfortunately, we don't know a lot. But we do know that if you interview people when they're admitted to Betty Ford, we did this at Betty Ford Hospital, 90% of them met criteria for a depressive disorder. If you follow them along the course of abstinence and treatment, in excess of 15%, and in some surveys 30%, have persistent depressive features, and suicidality is also reported. So heroin, yes, that's the problem du jour, but the people who are addicted to it are also much more likely to use alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, and other drugs for the simple reason that the core neuroanatomy is the same for all drugs of abuse. The final common pathway is virtually the same for all drugs of abuse. For me, where does this fit into psychiatry? So I've always been a proponent of psychiatrists in addiction, and for many reasons. But this is going to be the most compelling to all of you, that so many addicted people are so commonly comorbid that if we don't evaluate and treat their comorbidity, they'll definitely relapse. I'm going to present some cases that you can read about in the literature, but the literature would be kind of my kind of literature. Kurt Cobain, like Morrison, Joplin, Hendrix, was dead at 27, like Amy Winehouse, by the way, as well. A self-inflicted gunshot wound. Suicide note was present. There was no question about that, and he had heroin in his blood. According to Courtney Love and his brother and other other biographical material, he had overdosed many times. In fact, Courtney Love had carried naloxone with her and resuscitated him one time when he overdosed right before a Paris concert. So to think that opioid overdose reversal is a cure or treatment isn't supported by this data. Yes, it's a treatment that prevents death, but if we don't do anything with that teachable moment, if there's no intervention, if there's no treatment, you're likely to have repeat overdose. And a recent study, by the way, from Harvard shows about the same thing. They followed people who had been naloxone reversed and found that they tended to be reversed 3, 4, 5 times. He's often used, Kurt Cobain, as a description of what's wrong with addiction-only treatment. And I'll give you an idea of why. Because in April, he was actually admitted to a treatment program, and the treatment program did not have a psychiatrist. The treatment program did not even have a psychiatric evaluation. The treatment program did not have a psychiatric history, and the treatment program did not have a psychiatric family history. And in his case, all of those would have been critical, because his family history showed a family history of suicide. He had 2 uncles who took their own lives, a great-grandfather who committed suicide at a family meeting. Not only did he have a family history of suicide, he talked about suicide as a teenager. There is even some evidence in things written about him that he talked about suicide in elementary school. He came upon a suicide victim on a tree who hanged himself, and he discovered this man. So I do think there would have been an evidence that anhedonia, depression, and suicide were a risk. And at 27, he's in the prime group from which many people, unfortunately. So what does SAMHSA say? SAMHSA says if a person is depressed and they use cocaine, their risk of suicide increases many, many, many times. And cocaine use alone is a risk factor in suicide, of course, because they're dopamine depleted, depressed, anhedonic. This is so evident to people in the arts that Woody Allen named a movie Anhedonia, and it was renamed Annie Hall. But his working title for the movie was Anhedonia. So why are psychiatrists the last ones to get this? This is a really important thing. Self-injury, you have to pay attention to. It's risen in importance in the same groups that are using. And so here we get back to Nora's grandfather, which is there's a direct relationship in this double trouble, alcohol and depression, alcohol and suicide. And I say it's because alcohol targets the brain's reinforcement centers, alcohol targets the brain's dopamine and other pleasure centers, that in chronic use there's a disassembling of these systems. They're disorganized, they don't function as well, brain reward threshold changes as a result, and depression, anhedonia, and suicidal thinking come in, along with poor concentration and memory, sleep dysregulation, appetite changes, sex changes, and so forth. Another case example might be more recent. And so in this one, most people don't realize that Charlie Sheen was an elite high school athlete, that he was the reason he got one of the roles where he was a pitcher was that he could really pitch. And he looks like a pitcher. He also played ice hockey. He was a very, very talented athlete. And previously named Carlos Irwin Estevez. And went from Santa Monica High School to his mugshot. Let's listen to him in his own words about and think about him from a psychiatric interview point of view when he's totally abstinent, passes a drug test, and is on TV.
He really wanted to prove to you that he is clean now.
Yes, good morning again, George. And he claims no drugs right now, but we did talk a lot about his past drug use. Charlie Sheen has never been more candid about it and makes no excuses for it. He also shared with us some of what really happened that night last month when he was rushed to the hospital after a drug-filled night with porn stars. Your anger and your hate, I think, is coming off as erratic to people.
Passion, my passion. It's all
okay,
passion.
Your passion
yes.
is coming off as erratic
right.
to people.
Well, you borrow my brain for 5 seconds and just be like, dude, can't handle it. Unplug this bastard. Yeah, because it fires in a way that is, I don't know, maybe not from this particular terrestrial realm.
I think some of those things that you're putting out there are making people think something's wrong with you.
That has nothing to do with me, really. I mean, they're entitled to, I suppose, interpret stuff as they must. What are you a doctor of?
Some are saying that you're bipolar.
Wow, what does that mean?
I guess that, you know, you're on two ends of the spectrum.
Wow. And then what? What's the cure? Medicine? Make me like them? Not going to happen. I'm by winning.
You know, in addiction medicine, we've only used him as an example of addiction, because most people, when given the choice of using cocaine or continuing in employment for $50 million a year, choose the $50 million a year choice. But decision-making is part of the process. And he's turned into a cartoon. So I think that these kinds of examples point up the importance of a complete psychiatric evaluation, thinking about the patient in terms of what Kantian would say, their premorbid psychiatric evaluation, their family history, thinking about addiction psychiatry in this is from the archives recently, in a comprehensive framework that would also include the abstinence state and consideration of drug-induced depression, drug-induced anhedonia, drug-induced sleep disorders, drug-induced memory that are persistent and can trigger both relapse and a sense of despair, suicidality and actual suicide completion. And so when we think of dual disorders, we should think it's the rule, in my opinion, rather than the exception. And every bit of evidence that I have, both clinically and in working in this field for 45 years, would suggest that to be the case. Maybe that's the reason that in treatment samples, when we treat people, even with medically assisted treatments that our group and others have advanced, that 5-year outcomes are in the 20% range. And maybe the reason that we're doing so much better with cigarette smoking is because we do realize that abstinence is only one part of it, but we had Wellbutrin, a dopamine-augmenting antidepressant. We have dopamine-active treatments for smoking cessation, and we're all sensitized to the comorbidity of depression and cigarette smoking and are willing and able to treat that, whereas addiction patients tend to be treated in non-medical facilities outside of the mainstream, and even the rich and famous don't have access to a full psychiatric assessment, evaluation, and post-addiction reevaluation. Thank you very much. I'm going to quickly answer some questions because you have Vaughn McCall, who's a great expert, up next. And naltrexone is now available as injectable, which has changed things a great deal. It lasts one for a month. There'll be a new form that will probably be available that will last even longer, and that's particularly useful in a post-overdose scenario where at least you'd have 30 days of abstinence. What percent of addiction is genetic? You really have to break that down by smoking versus non-smoking. For alcohol, the data is the best because it was based on genetic studies of Irish in Ireland, but I don't like that study because when we site visited, I went on a UN WHO trip, it turned out that Guinness was being promoted to pregnant women as a source of iron. So the epigenetic effects of that, pregnant women drinking. So I think that's fentanyl is a rising drug of abuse. Yes, there's a nice article in the Times about how, as the Mexican cannabis cartels were taken out of cannabis production by U.S. Law changes, that they switched into heroin and now spiking heroin with fentanyl. There are some sufentanil and carfentanil added that make it very, very difficult to reverse even with naloxone. So you just have to keep that in mind. These are illegal drugs, by the way. They're not tested for safety, so it's a user beware. And what is the research on variables that improve recovery? I have a paper on that, but the best data is really in the 37-state physician recovery data. In the MAT data, you're hard-pressed to find anything more than 2 years, and I like 5 years, but still, pre-employment status, age of onset, and of course, smoking is injection without a needle, so you're always better off in recovery when the drug's oral. Thank you.